Commission sequence 0. There's still a sequence O above sequence 1. Sequence O is equivalent to a true God. There can only be one sequence O per pathway. Is this the true meaning of the paths of the divine? As long as one consumes the corresponding potion, does a ritual, and grasps the acting method to digest the Beyonder characteristic, an ordinary person can become a god one step at a time. This is truly blasphemous. Could the main ingredients of the final potion be the godhood, divine blood, and body of the eternal blazing sun? The information on the diary's last page was filled with so much information that Klein almost couldn't think. He almost made additional body movements. The 22 paths of the divine correspond to the 22 sequence OS. Sequence 0, sun does sound very powerful perhaps. There's a sequence O, death. I wonder what the names corresponding to the goddess and the lord of the storms are. According to Emperor Rosel's description, some of these cards are identical to the major arcana tarot cards, but some of them are different. The cards of blasphemy he created were standardized with the names of the potions. These can no longer be called potions. Could the reason that the emperor regretted not choosing the seer, apprentice, marauder pathways be because their corresponding sequence OS have yet to appear? Then what was the reason for the sudden personification of the hidden sage, who was symbolically a deity? What was Rosel plotting in the end? It feels like he became the enemy of everyone in the world, and that only seems possible if it was set into motion by that mysterious and ancient organization. The primordial demoness is the name of sequence O for the demoness pathway. Klein gradually found his train of thought, and he restrained the turmoil that was going through his mind. He knew that he couldn't lose himself in this matter. He had to recover as quickly as possible, otherwise, Justice and the hanged man would discover something amiss and find it odd. Mr. Fool has been reading that page too long. I really want to obtain one of the cards of blasphemy that Emperor Rosel created. I want to know what else there is, other than the godhood-providing potion formulas and the corresponding rituals. Klein suppressed his shock and puzzlement and made Rosel's diary disappear from his hand. He rapped the corner of the bronze table and looked to the side. Miss Justice, well done. You finished Backerland in less than a week. According to the agreement, what kind of payment do you want? Backerland is dead. That fast? Alger had left the islands in the past few days and hadn't received the appropriate information. He was astonished for a moment, which made Audrey, who was secretly observing him, feel delighted. Even if Alger was in the capital of the Rorsted archipelago, the city of generosity, Bayam, he might not have been informed in a timely fashion. After all, cable telegraph could only transmit limited information. Unless it was particularly urgent or important, there was always a delay of a few days. Sometimes, it would even take the colonists of the Rorsted archipelago a month or two to get an update on the latest situation in the northern continent. Restraining his thoughts, the hanged man looked at Mr. Fool in the thick fog and respectfully said with a hint of humility, "I'm very sorry. I just managed to contact someone and couldn't help. This is a commission, not a help request. Don't worry about it." Klein chuckled. He turned his gaze back to Miss Justice, waiting for her to say what she wanted in return. "May the goddess bless me. Please don't let Miss Justice's request be too difficult. It's best if I can repay her with knowledge. I've learned quite a lot of amazing things from Rosel's diary." Klein silently prayed to the goddess. Of course, he was very clear that with the gray fog separating them, the Evernight goddess definitely wouldn't be able to hear his prayer. Audrey's eyes darted around as she thought for a few seconds. "Be honest and not greedy, Audrey, and stick to your principles." She gave a faint smile and said, "No, I'm actually the one still owing you. No, I owe your Adora the bounty." Rear Admiral Kalangos' bounty was worth a total of 30,000 pounds. I should give your Adora 15,000 pounds. Killing Backerland cost 10,000 pounds, so I still need to pay an additional 5,000 pounds. However, due to the matter with Backerland, my finances are recently quite tight. I can only pay this bounty in a few months. Mr. Fool, is that all right?" After she finished speaking, Audrey quietly exhaled. She felt that the little stone pressing against her heart was finally gone. Although discussing money and calculating the payment in front of Mr. Fool feels somewhat inappropriate, I can't hide the rewards I received from his adorer. Audrey sighed silently. As for the huge plantation worth more than 8,000 pounds, it was a private form of gratitude from Duke Negan, and not a bounty. 5,000 pounds. I can get another 5,000 pounds. Kalangos' total bounty actually reached 30,000 pounds. Klein was startled. Immediately, he fell into an intense mental struggle. I'm supposed to pay this bounty to Mr. Azek, but I won't be able to get in touch with him for a long time. Putting the money aside would be a waste. I might as well use this money to enhance myself. When the time comes, I'll repay him by providing help. Klein made up his mind 3 seconds later as he lightly nodded at Miss Justice. Sure. Upon hearing Mr. Fool's response, Audrey's graceful seating posture remained the same, but her heart was completely relaxed. At that moment, Klein leaned back in his chair and fell silent. Then he manipulated his smurf secretly from a commandeering position. The world coughed and said, "Can I speak now?" Audrey looked at Mr. Fool, and seeing that he didn't say a thing, she nodded slightly and said, "Sure." At the same time, she once again did a read on the new member of the world and made a judgment. When I mentioned that the assassination of Ambassador Backerland was a result of my commissioning, he didn't show any shock or surprise. He either doesn't know the importance of the matter, not understanding the importance of an ambassador, or he's someone who can keep his calm and is good at hiding his emotions and bodily movements. The way he mouths his words doesn't match what he said. It should have been translated by Mr. Fool as well, which makes it impossible for me to get his original vocal tics or know what language he usually uses. Thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind before Mr. World's hoarse voice sounded. I wish to obtain the true root of a mistrine, at least 60 milliliters of its juice, as well as the spring of the elves' marrow crystals and the complete spinal fluid of a dark-patterned black panther. Which one of you can provide it, or provide any relevant clues? What do you wish to exchange them for? Klein added the Beyonder ingredient needed by the apothecary to his commission, so that the Tarot Club members wouldn't be able to guess the main ingredients of the formula he wanted. Before Justice and the Hanged Man could react, the son, who had been silent the entire time, finally opened his mouth and said, "I know where Miss Treents are, and I can help you obtain the material. However, I must wait until I finish my advancement and have sufficient strength to join the corresponding patrol team." Recently, he had been accumulating merit points and rewards. He was working hard to obtain the main ingredients for the light suppliant through the City of Silver's officials and private market. He was still lacking quite a bit. As expected of the dangerous City of Silver with its numerous monsters, Klein silently commented in admiration, allowing the world to ask, "Then what do you wish to receive in exchange?" Without hesitation, Derek replied, "A weapon that suits me and can increase my combat strength." The reason why he didn't mention the corresponding ingredients for light suppliant was because City of Silver had them all. They could be obtained through his own hard work. Upon hearing this request, Klein immediately thought of the inscribed steel sword that had appeared at the Beyonder gathering organized by the elderly gentleman, Eye of Wisdom. It was sharp enough, had the effect of exorcism and purification, and could be used for 3 years. It was valued at 500 pounds, perfectly matching the son's described requirements. "Why didn't you say so earlier? It has already been bought by someone else." Klein silently stared at the members, while the world nodded and said, "I will find a weapon that meets your requirements as soon as possible. Is this transaction to be witnessed by Mr. Fool?" Klein nodded slightly to express his agreement. At that moment, Audrey shot a glance at the son and warned him. Apart from the Miss Treent's juice, Mr. World's requested ingredients correspond to sequence 7. The rough price is about 500-700 pounds. She felt that the son was too naive, and was worried that he would be cheated by the unreadable Mr. World with cheap weapons. Although Mr. Fool is impartial and advocates fair equal exchange, it's not his place to stop it if both sides agree. After all, some items are of low value, but there are people who are in urgent need, so adding a premium to the price is very normal, Audrey thought to herself. A sequence 7 formula is about 800 pounds, Alger added. He had an instinctive aversion towards new members. Klein translated with great difficulty, for he didn't know what the currency unit of the pound corresponded to in the City of Silver, and could only use a Series 9 potion formula as a unit. "Do you understand?" Derek slightly nodded, and then quietly added, "Thank you." The world maintained his silent and staid temperament, and didn't comment on what had just happened. He turned to Justice and the Hanged Man, waiting for their response. Audrey thought for a few seconds and said, "Potion formula for psychiatrists and their corresponding Beyonder ingredients. That's sequence 7 of the spectator pathway. You can gather the information first, and there's no rush to purchase them. Once I have clues regarding the dark patterned Black Panther and spring of the elves' marrow crystals, we can proceed. If you are willing to exchange it for gold pounds, you can buy it at any time. Although I'm out of money recently, I can still raise quite a bit if it's urgent, Audrey comforted herself. Alger said in a deep voice, potion formula of the Sailor Pathway Sequence 6 Wind Bless. This will be more expensive than the Beyonder ingredients that you want, combined. TF you find it, you can think of the additional payment needed to make up for the difference. T can't guarantee that I'll be able to help you gather those ingredients. Even if it's just one of them, you don't need to expend any resources ahead of time. Mr. Hanged Man should have a close relationship with the Church of the Lord of Storms. He should be able to get the wind-blessed formula normally, right? Is he trying to hide the fact that he's digesting the seafarer potion quickly? Klein was startled. All right, the world answered in a low voice and then said, I have another request. Same tune, the world looked around and said, I want to get information about all the abject nobles in the Lone Kingdom, including their current addresses. The more details, the better. He didn't directly mention Baronet Pound, since Detective Sherlock Moriarty was currently handling an investigation regarding an underground structure that involved the Pound family. Klein didn't want justice to figure out the world's identity through this connection. I can't ignore any details, he emphasized to himself. Audrey stared blankly upon hearing that. She once again examined the member at the end of the long bronze table and probed, What do you want to do? The world laughed with a hoarse voice. That's not something you need to worry about. I'm only searching for some things. I won't do them any harm. I can swear on this point and allow Mr. Fool to bear witness. Mr. World is really good at controlling his body language. Is his sequence the nemesis of a spectator or telepathist? Audrey thoughtfully nodded and said, I know some information about abject aristocrats, but it's not sufficiently detailed, concrete, or comprehensive. I need some time to gather all of it. It'll take 3 or 4 days, is that okay? As a noble, it was compulsory to have some knowledge about people in the same class. Audrey would always hear interesting stories when she attended various balls, banquets, and saloons, but they would all be fragmented and could hardly be considered a comprehensive body of knowledge. After all, she wasn't an expert in this field, and she still needed to fill in the details by flipping through books, asking around, and checking references to not miss any abject noble. No problem. The world laughed deeply. Then what payment would you like in return? Things I can pay you with right now are some secret history from the 4th epoch, knowledge of some Beyonder pathways, and a few formulas. Frankly, I don't think that information concerning abject nobles is worth sequence 7 or 8 potions. If you have any other requests, I can attempt to complete them. It's not of equal value to sequence 8 or 7 potion formulas, which means I'm unable to make a corresponding request for the psychiatrist formula. Audrey began to ponder seriously. During this process, she sneaked a glance at Mr. Fool, hoping for a hint, only to discover that Mr. Fool was shrouded in the gray fog and had no reaction whatsoever. He was like a god staring at the land beneath him. All right, Audrey finally made a decision and smiled. Do you want to hear about knowledge regarding other Beyonder pathways? But this is on the premise that I'm not aware of them. Dear Mr. Fool, can you be the judge for this? Yes, Klein answered calmly. Then let's have a private conversation. Audrey looked at the world. At that moment, Klein rapped the table, isolating the son and the hanged man from hearing or seeing the exchange. He deliberately nodded to his smurf, indicating that they could begin their private conversation. The world looked at Miss Justice and spoke with his usual hoarse voice. Do you know anything about the Demoness sect? Audrey recalled the information she paid the hanged man Alger £1,000 for, and answered briefly with caution. I know what they believe in and what era they began from, as well as the Beyonder pathways they control and the inclination of their upper echelons. The world laughed hoarsely and said, I understand. You don't know much. The Demoness sect controls the assassin pathway. The sequence 8 is instigator. That's what I know, Audrey said, partially to inform the world and partially to show her anticipation. The world raised his hand and stroked his chin before saying, Then, do you know the corresponding sequence 7? Audrey shook her head slightly. I'll be very happy to hear it from you. The assassin pathway sequence 7 is called Witch, the world said simply. Witch? Audrey jumped in fright at this word. She naturally made the corresponding connections in her mind. Then, if a man consumes this potion, how is he supposed to act? wearing beautiful dresses and putting on exquisite makeup, imitating a lady's every move. She was a little disgusted, yet strangely amused as the thought came to her. No, Miss Justice. When a man consumes this potion, he will no longer be considered a male. He will become a true lady. Klein resisted the urge to chortle, as he controlled the world's response. Goddess, the witch potion can change a person's sex. Audrey blurted out. This is really unbelievable. Mr. Fool didn't deny it, which means it's true. This is simply a miracle. This is the mysterious Bay Underworld. This is a world filled with all sorts of inexplicable things. This is the world I long for. Why am I feeling a little excited? After calming down a little, Audrey quickly and guiltily glanced at Mr. Fool and made a tiny confession that she had actually chanted the name of the Evernight goddess in front of him. The world said in a low, hoarse voice, yes, but it can only make men become women. Women will accordingly have their charms enhanced. Whether it's their appearance or skin condition, they will become significantly improved on the basis of their original looks. This is the reason why the upper echelons of the demoness sect are all women. Then what flaws does it have? Audrey suddenly felt her interest was aroused. The world answered in an unhurried manner. The requirement for their acting is to become evil-doers who bring about calamity, disease, and pain. Audrey exhaled slightly and felt a little disappointed. Her mind whirled quickly, and she immediately had a new question. TF, and I'm saying if, an animal consumes the witch formula without dying or losing control, would the enhancement of its charms be more suited to human tastes or focused on charms for its own species? For example, a female cat which makes all male cats become fanatical towards it. The world was momentarily unsure how to respond. After a few seconds, he said, I've never studied such matter. Before Audrey could ask further, he added, the corresponding sequence 6 for the witch pathway is pleasure, or the demoness of pleasure. The requirement for acting is to bring pleasure to both men and women, mainly in that aspect, as well as controlling or influencing them. The demonesses of this sequence are very good at using special spider silk. Audrey gaped her beautiful mouth, then she silently closed it again, deeply regretting her pinings from before. By knowing such information, it will allow you to effectively identify demonesses. Are you pleased with this payment? The world asked. Audrey nodded gently and said, it helps me a lot. The deal is completed. I will help you gather information on the abject nobles as soon as possible. Shall I give it to you the next time we meet? The world thought for a moment and asked, can it be faster? Then I'll offer the information I gathered to Mr. Fool and request that he bestow them to you. Mr. Fool, is that okay? Audrey turned her head and asked. In the thick gray fog, Klein nodded his head in agreement. At the same time, he busily controlled the world to whisper, he. He detected the different way she said the word. Noticing the world's astonishment, the corners of Audrey's mouth curled up slightly, her eyes rolling upwards as she intentionally didn't make any explanation. Klein rapped the long bronze table, indicating the end of the private exchange. Then he once again manipulated the world to say, I have one more problem. This newcomer has indeed accumulated a lot of requests. Audrey looked over, unsurprised. Alger and Derek both indicated they were listening through their body language. The world said hoarsely, I want to know if there are any more high-sequence Bayonders in the Sauron family in Inti. While the world spoke, Klein looked at the sun through the corners of his eye and saw that the youth didn't have any additional reaction. From the looks of it, the City of Silver doesn't have records of the Sauron family. This family most likely made an uprising after the cataclysm. Klein looked around thoughtfully and discovered Justice and the Hanged Man looking at each other, obviously unaware of the answer. The sun was undoubtedly at a loss in silence. Thus he lightly tapped the table again and said, let me answer this question. What can you pay for it? Before he could finish his sentence, Klein hurriedly controlled the world to say, a formula, a sequence 7 formula. Okay. Deal. Klein created an environment for a private exchange, as he silently stared at his smurf for a few seconds. Audrey and Alger, who were blocked, once again felt how unfathomable Mr. Fool was. They were both curious about the answer, but they also felt that it was of no use to them. It wasn't worth it to spend a sequence 7 potion formula in exchange for that. After the private exchange, Klein deliberately made the world bow and say in a hoarse voice, Honorable Mr. Fool, thank you for your answer. It was very helpful to me. This is an equivalent exchange. There's no need to thank me. Klein endured the goosebumps that suddenly surfaced on his skin as he answered indifferently. The open communication that followed lasted less than 10 minutes. Then he announced the end of tarot gathering before severing the connections with the Crimson Star. After the figures of justice, the hanged man, and the sun dissipated into streams of light, Klein looked at the world and chuckled. With a smurf, a lot of things are really much more convenient. Unfortunately, the all-black eye cannot be used outside the gray fog. What a pity! As he thought that, he controlled the world to stand up and bow, then he let it melt into the majestic palace. As he had to divert some of his attention in order to control his smurf, Klein had expended a great deal of his spirituality. He didn't continue staying in that space, and after retrieving the all-black eye and placing it behind the bronze table, he immediately returned to the real world. At that moment, there was a rare case of backland sunshine, seen in autumn or winter, behind the tightly shut curtain. Klein didn't have the time to take in this view. He slept for half an hour to recover some of his energy. After waking up, due to having gained Miss Justice's promise and the fact that it wasn't urgent, he had no plans on searching for information at the library, and instead decided to head to one of the many cemetery sites on the outskirts of Backland before nightfall. Klein was going to test the influence of Azek's copper whistle to understand its scope and limitation. Of course, the experiment would only be carried out after dark. The reason why he was heading out now was that it would be very strange and very eye-catching to hire a carriage to visit a cemetery in the evening. The hospital. When the steam metro arrived at the southern bank of the Tussock River, Klein rented a carriage and headed to the Aston Cemetery on the outskirts of the South Borough, which was managed by the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. Under the darkness of dusk, the trees around the cemetery seemed to bare their fangs and brandish their claws, blocking out the light like monsters lurking in the darkness. After the carriage driver took the fare solely Klein paid, he looked at the cemetery and muttered, "Do you need me to wait here for you?" "No, there's no need. I'm here to visit a friend." Klein came up with an excuse, and he immediately noticed the change in the driver's face. This is a cemetery, to visit a friend with the sky already dark. The driver could hear his own heart thumping. Klein jolted to his senses, smiled, and added, "He's the tomb keeper here." The carriage driver was immediately relieved, but he didn't dare stay. He quickly drove the horses and left. Klein circled the graveyard until the night truly set in. After dark, the smoke and dust emissions decreased by a lot. In addition to the biting cold wind, the fog in the air thinned a lot. Although few stars could be seen, the crimson moon made a furtive appearance, covering the ground with a veil-like glow. Klein tapped his chest 4 times clockwise, drawing out the crimson moon. Then he put on his gloves, pushed himself over the iron fence, and entered the cemetery. He looked around with a high degree of caution, randomly found a secluded corner, took out Azek's copper whistle, and held it in his hand. Not far in front of him was a tombstone. The photograph on it was dirty, and the epitaph appeared extremely blurry in the moonlight. Klein carefully read it for a few seconds before figuring out what they were. "Friend, if you're passing by, help me up." "Thanks. A very humorous gentleman, I choose you." Klein stopped, leaned back against the trees that sheltered the grave from the sun and rain, and waited patiently in the cold, chilly night. He threw Azek's copper whistle up before catching it firmly, repeating it several times to pass the time until 20 minutes later. No signs of the dead coming back to life. Klein clicked his pocket watch shut, surveyed his surroundings, and confirmed the results. "I'll come back here in 2 days to see if there are any additional changes. If there are none, it means that Mr. Azek's copper whistle won't be able to affect corpses that have been laid to rest through a priest's ritual." Klein silently muttered to himself, and he put the ancient and exquisite copper whistle back into his pocket. There were 3 kinds of burials in the Lone Kingdom. The first type had coffins and corpses, suitable for the middle and upper classes living in abundance. The second type was the ones without corpses, so a cremation was held. The remaining ashes were placed in urns. This was the choice of the lower middle class and technical workers who would pay for the cremation but found coffins to be too wasteful. But there were also times when religious and governmental factors had an impact, such as the believers of the eternal blazing sun. The majority of them underwent cremation, and the poor people only needed to pay a small fee for the cremation due to the help they received from the government. The third only belonged to the poor. They couldn't afford coffins, and they didn't wish for cremation, so they just wrapped the corpses up and buried them. But Klein had already determined from the tombstones and tombs that the target of his experiment was the kind which involved a coffin and a corpse. If Isaac's copper whistle really can cause the dead to rise, even if the target had rotted into a pile of bones, there shouldn't be a complete lack of reaction. Even if the lid of the coffin cannot be opened, it should have at least created a dull thud. As he walked towards the fence, Klein suddenly thought of a non-rigorous part of the experiment. Yes, I need to categorize them. The corpses here have been buried for quite a while. I should find a target that was recently buried. Only by doing so will I be able to arrive at the most accurate conclusion. After that, Klein basically played a game of cat and mouse with the cemetery guardians, before finding a grave that had completed a burial ceremony during the day. This time he waited for half an hour, but he still didn't find anything abnormal. Phew, I can basically determine that Mr. Isaac's copper whistle can't affect a corpse that has undergone a ritual that puts the soul to rest. That's quite weak. No, that's not right. This copper whistle isn't meant to cause the dead to come alive. It's used to summon messengers, so affecting a corpse is a negative effect. Klein tightened his double-breasted coat and walked toward the iron fence. He planned on heading home to have a change of clothes before trying out his second experiment. The target of the second experiment group were the recently deceased corpses that haven't been laid to rest via a ritual. Such targets often existed in a hospital's morgue. Climbing over the fence, Klein made his way back to the South Borough on foot in the dreary, dark night. The surroundings were deathly still and quiet. Only the evergreen, dust-covered trees lightly swayed. It reminded him of the night he had been resurrected from the dead. Back then, he too had to walk from the cemetery to the city. Klein sighed and suddenly began to run, as if trying to get rid of the melancholy that filled him. More than half an hour later, he rented a carriage in Southborough and headed for the nearest steam metro station. There was still about an hour before the metro stopped running, and this could save him quite a bit of money. In the wee hours of the morning, Klein changed into a grayish-blue worker's uniform and wore a cap as he made his way to St. Eston's Hospital in the Backland Bridge area. This was a charity hospital belonging to the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. Many of the poor died here due to illness, and since there was nowhere for them to place their bodies, they had to be kept in the hospital morgue. There, the corpses awaited cremation from the government or be donated to the medical schools. This phenomenon was very common in summer, but there weren't many in the autumn or winter after it cooled down. However, in an era without air conditioning or equipment to keep the temperature cool, the hospital's morgue couldn't keep the corpses for too long. Donated bodies would be quickly embalmed, and bodies to be buried the next day would be cleaned up. Of course, these were the rules enforced in summer. In autumn and winter, the rules were relatively relaxed. Therefore, there were still many corpses left overnight in the morgue during this period. The morgue at St. Eston was underground. It was relatively cool, even during the summer, and was biting cold during autumn and winter. Based on what he had learned as a nighthawk, Klein relied on a clown's agility and balance to sneak into the basement while avoiding the doctors and nurses that were on duty. Before he even got close to the morgue, he felt a chill down his spine. After quickly moving past the janitor's room, Klein took out a piece of wire and lightly unlocked the door to the morgue. This was one of the methods of infiltration and tracking. He slowly and silently pushed open the door to the morgue with his black-gloved right hand. At the same time, he cloaked Isaac's copper whistle in his spirituality to determine if such a method could eliminate the negative effects. The temperature in the morgue seemed to be lower than the corridor. Most of the corpses were bagged up and placed in different iron cabinets. Only a few were placed on the long table in the central open space, as if they were awaiting examination. As a Sequence 8 clown, Klein was no longer afraid of such scenes. He just instinctively felt uncomfortable. Carefully, he closed the door and walked around the long tables. After about 10 minutes, Klein let out a breath of cold air and confirmed that none of the corpses had come to life. It's about time. He took out his gold pocket watch and opened it. When he was ready, Klein withdrew his spirituality and stopped enveloping Isaac's copper whistle. He wasn't sure if it was a psychological effect, but he had a baffling feeling that the surroundings had become even more silent. As a seer, he fully believed in his instinct. He stopped pacing back and forth and retreated towards the door. Time ticked by, and Klein determined that it took about 2 minutes. At that moment, a corpse on a long table suddenly sat up. Bang! 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 The surrounding iron cabinets emitted a series of banging noises, as though all hell was about to break loose. Bang, bang, bang. Upon hearing such a commotion and seeing the corpses sit up, Klein suddenly said in a low voice, "Crimson." Immediately following that, he injected his spirituality into a requiem charm and threw it out. Icy blue flames burned quietly, and serene and gentle blackness spread out. The corpses lay down once again, and the banging sounds coming from the cabinets came to an abrupt halt. Klein, who had experienced a similar situation, didn't relax and used another requiem charm. As there were many corpses around him, he used a third charm to be safe, using up everything that he had. Not bad indeed. It only affects corpses that haven't been put to rest via a ritual. This includes corpses that haven't been dead for too long and zombies. Using my spirituality to shield the whistle can prevent such effects, Klein thought with a smile. Seeing that none of the corpses were making any abnormal reactions, he prepared to open the door and leave. At that moment, he suddenly heard footsteps coming from the outside and saw a faint light seeping in. The elderly janitor had been attracted by the banging sound in the morgue. He was approaching with a lantern in hand. Klein looked around, placing his hand on the door. He nimbly jumped up, stopping at the spot between the door and the ceiling. His fingers dug into the bumps and cracks as he maintained perfect balance. Krieg. The elderly janitor opened the door with his key and entered the morgue. He took a few steps forward, held up his lantern, and examined the iron cabinets and long tables as well as the corpses. Behind him, Klein nimbly jumped down and landed silently. Seizing the opportunity, Klein quickly escaped from the morgue. He used the janitor's room to hide for a few seconds before carefully returning to the upper floor. After the elderly janitor surveyed the surroundings and didn't find anything out of the ordinary, he mumbled a sentence in fear of the corpses and quickly left. He locked the door and didn't stay any longer. Returning to the guardroom, he wrapped a thin blanket around himself and took several minutes to calm his racing heart before mumbling to himself in a low voice, "Those old guys always tell me about the weird things that happen in the morgue, hoping to scare me. Those weird sounds just now should count as well. It doesn't matter. Those corpses didn't come back to life either. Pewee, there are no such things as zombies and wraiths." At the same time, Klein was walking comfortably along the quiet, dark streets, happy to be free of a latent threat. He looked at the elegant gas lamps that lined the sides of the street and looked forward to the future Beyonder gathering. As long as he obtained a weapon with a special effect, he would be able to obtain one of the main ingredients of a magician. Although I don't have much money right now, I still have a lot of assets that I can use to exchange. For example, the telepathist potion formula, or the formulas for bard and light supplement. Furthermore, my clown potion is digesting at a faster rate than I expected due to a series of events, and my discovery of the essence needed for act. It's close to being completely digested. Along the streets of Backland at night, Klein left his mind wandering. Psychology alchemists on the outskirts of Empress Borough, in a wide, empty horse track. Audrey Hall deliberately led a chestnut mare to a corner and pretended to discuss something with Viscount Glain. She was wearing white pants and knee-high black boots, adorned with a simple blouse and a black jacket that reached her waist. In addition, she donned a helmet of the same color. She looked especially valiant and beautiful, and Susie, her golden retriever, was obediently sitting by her feet. What seemed like a tiny leather satchel hung from her back. Disguised as Viscount Glain's servant, Zio glanced enviously at Audrey's long, straight legs and unconsciously tiptoed. Just horse riding is so blasé. Only when it is combined with hunting does it become imbued with life. Of course, I mean the equestrian skills for men. No matter what a beautiful lady does, it would still be a sight to behold. Glain sized up Audrey and said half-jokingly. Audrey replied with a slight smile, "The next hunt is still months away." Every year from June to the New Year, the aristocrats of the Lone Kingdom would come to Backland to attend various banquets, dances, and salons, as per tradition. This was a very important event for them, and many things would be decided within a few months. After the New Year, the nobles would return to their fiefdom, their castles, country estates, and large plantations, and spend their leisure time there. In such times, the most popular sport was hunting. The nobles would invite guests of similar status to enjoy the pleasure of horse riding and chasing prey. As long as their financial situation allowed it, they weren't stingy with buying hounds. The most famous of the hounds was the foxhound. T already missed that life. Backland is a place where people feel constrained, and its air is indescribably terrible. Of course, I still enjoy its extravagance. Viscount Glaint wore his gloves and stepped back to make it easier for Audrey to talk to Zio and Four. "Honorable Miss Audrey, why have you called us here this time?" Zio initiated the question as she retracted her gaze. Audrey took a large portion of most of her recent income. She was honest and generous, a rarely encountered good employer. I seemed to smell the ink of money again. Hopefully, the mission wouldn't be too difficult. Miss Audrey is perfect in every way except for one thing. Every mission is unexpected and very dangerous, Zio thought, feeling both anticipation and apprehension. She couldn't help but glance sideways at Fours. She noticed that her companion, disguised as a maid, was looking right at her. The expressions reflected in their eyes looked very similar. Audrey held her gloves, smiled reservedly and elegantly before saying, "It's a simple request this time." As she spoke, she motioned with her eyes for Zio and Fours to open the leather satchel on Susie. Zio, who had always been known for her proactiveness, immediately took 2 steps forward and bent down to reach out with her hand. During this short period of time, she had originally wanted to pat Susie's head to show that she meant no harm. But just as she extended her right palm, Susie had already turned her head, turning her body half around, placing the small leather satchel in front of her. "I'm usually popular with animals, for example mosquitoes." Zio kept her expression unchanged as she unzipped the satchel and took out a stack of papers from Susie's leather pouch. She stood up and took a look at the stack of paper. She saw that it depicted a young man with ordinary looks, but his neatly combed hair, round glasses, and mocking brown eyes all looked very familiar to her. I must have seen him somewhere. Zio looked down and saw the corresponding description. Formerly used name Lanevis, wanted swindler. I know where I've seen him before. Zio was suddenly enlightened and almost made an inelegant gesture of slapping her forehead. Before she met Audrey, one of the main sources of her income was flipping through newspapers, researching wanted posters, and using her connections in many gangs in East Borough to seek out criminals who were worth fat bounty. I had thought of finding this Lanevis, who has a bounty of £100. Besides, he swept away more than £10,000 in cash. However, I've recently been too busy with Miss Audrey's requests and had forgotten about this matter. Zio and Fours looked at each other and then asked frankly, "How much is this request worth?" "How much is the request worth?" Audrey was startled for a moment. She had completely forgotten the matter of payment, as from her point of view, it was a test from Mr. Fool. When were examinees ever given money? £100. Audrey deliberated and gave a number. "Deal." Zio and Fours answered in unison. "If we can catch him, not only would we receive £100 from Miss Audrey, but we can also obtain an equal amount from the bounty. What a great mission." Zio asked casually, her eyes shining. "Why are you looking for this swindler? Did he swindle you of your money?" "I don't even know who he is. It's really a simple request." £100 was enough to complete the deal. "There's no need to tell Mr. Fool about this." "It's only £100. Audrey, with a polite smile, ignored Zio's question and instead mentioned, "I received word that he's in back." "Ah yes, there are a dozen or so portraits here, different portraits. I took into account that Lanevis must have disguised himself, so I'm giving you pictures of him without glasses, with a beard, with a change of hairstyle. Pictures based on conjectures. I'm also very good at drawing and painting." Audrey tilted her chin. Zio immediately forgot her previous question and said in pleasant surprise, "This is really good news." She felt as though she could already see the bounty of £200 beckoning at her. The mysterious person she had met at Mr. A's gathering had yet to establish contact with her. Therefore, all she could do was continue with her business of earning money. Audrey nodded indiscernibly. She muttered, "Do you have any leads on the matter regarding the psychology alchemists?" Fours adjusted her long curly hair, looked at Viscount Glaint, who was listening to the side, and said, "I recently joined a new Bayonder gathering. Rumor has it that the Spectator and Telepathist potion formulas have previously appeared there. I'm suspecting that one of the members from the gathering is from the psychology alchemist. TLL, apply to bring you with me the next gathering." "All right." Audrey deliberately didn't hide her joy. She had read their true state of mind from the colors, body language, and the subtle expressions of Zio and Fours, to judge their enthusiasm for the mission. They didn't lie regarding the psychology alchemists either. Viscount Glaint mumbled, "Audrey's matter seems to be on the brink of success." "Where's my formula, Audrey?" There are really no clues as of yet. The apothecary pathway is mostly in the south, where the Potter kingdom is. Forrest gestured with deep regret. All right, I'm still young. I'm only in my early 20s. I still have time to wait, Glaint replied in a humorous tone. All right, thank you for your help. See you again next time. Audrey bowed gracefully, wore her gloves, and mounted her horse as she rode down the track. Susie happily followed, as if she had found new entertainment. As he spent the night experimenting, it was already 9:34 of a Tuesday morning by the time Klein woke up. Biting into a piece of bread slathered with butter, he wore his coat and hat, hurried out the door, and wrote on the message book hanging by the doorbell's pull rope, "Owner is out and will be back after 5 in the afternoon." Actually, he didn't have much to do. It was purely to guard against a sudden visit from Millet Carter. If the other party found out that the detective he hired for a full £50 wasn't out and about, searching for information or organizing people to confirm the layout of the structure, and was instead at home leisurely drinking tea and reading novels, he would surely revoke the commission and not pay the last £40. I really have nothing to do but wait for Miss Justice's information. Klein stood at the end of the street and looked at the haze in the sky, while helplessly muttering to himself. He had already decided last night where he would spend the day. In the morning, practice shooting at the Kellogg Club, read the newspapers, enjoy a free lunch, take a nap in the afternoon, exercise through playing sports like squash. Once the Bravehearts bar opens, I'll take a carriage there and see if I can learn about more Beyonder gatherings from Caspar. Klein had no intention of looking for marriage. Although he was certain that he had more than one circle of Beyonders, he was afraid that Miss Bodyguard would also belong to those circles. It wouldn't be convenient for him to sell potion formulas, as it would arouse a high degree of suspicion. Since the true creator has given you the ability to divine and a strong body, would he still grant you potion formulas that you do not need? It's impossible just thinking about it. Klein filled in the details with his imagination as he boarded the public carriage that headed for Hillstonborough. Half an hour later, he entered the Kellogg Club and saw an acquaintance. It was Talem Dumont, the equestrian teacher who had recommended him to the club. He was Marygale's friend. Dressed in a black tweed overcoat, the brown-haired Talem walked over. He sized up Klein and said with an odd smile, "Good morning. Mary and Daragu are getting a divorce. Are you suspecting the reason why I joined the club?" Relying on the clown's ability, Klein easily made a surprised expression. "Really? That is really surprising." Talem gave him a deeply suspicious look and suddenly laughed. Have a friend who's been troubled about something recently. I want to know how good your marksmanship and fighting skills are." "A commission." He only asked about my marksmanship and fighting skills, not reasoning. "This is a request involving violence," Klein smiled and said. "I was planning on heading to the shooting range. You can take a look, but fighting requires an opponent to be able to see my standard." "Have learned how to fight before," Talem eagerly replied. Bang, bang, bang. Holding onto a revolver that he rented from the Kellogg Club with one hand, Klein pulled the trigger repeatedly, hitting the bulls accurately, with the worst shot hitting the 8 ring. By feeding his practice with live bullets, along with the superhuman control that he had after becoming a clown, his marksmanship was considered rather excellent. "If I continue practicing for a few months, I could even be considered a sharpshooter." Klein unloaded the revolver in satisfaction and cleared the empty shell. They fell to the ground noisily as he looked at Talem Dumont with a smile. "Are you satisfied?" "Very good." The equestrian teacher, Talem, had already taken off his black tweed overcoat and light gray sweater and adopted a boxing stance. "Come on, let me see the standard of your fighting skill. I can tell you frankly that I've received training as a trainee knight since I was young, and I've never let it go to waste. As a Beyonder, if I can't even beat an ordinary man who has only received training, then I might as well die." Klein cursed silently. Without taking off his double-breasted coat, he set down his revolver. Klein took 2 side steps and gestured to Talem that he could begin. He originally wanted to wriggle his finger to add to the atmosphere, but when he thought of the other party's strength, he couldn't be bothered to waste his time. Talem appeared to be a little excited as he began bounce-stepping a little. He suddenly pressed forward and threw out a punch to the right. Klein blocked and grabbed with his left hand, bent low and twisted his waist before reaching out his right palm, and did a smooth backflip. Thud! Talem flew out, landing on his back. Klein didn't exert any strength towards the end, only throwing him off his feet through the use of inertia. Impressive. Talon quickly stood up and gave a thumbs up. As expected of a famous detective. Your marksmanship and fighting skills are excellent. I only beat a weak chicken like you, so how can you tell that my fighting skills are very high? Klein secretly lampooned and asked with a smile, now that you have a better picture, can you tell me what kind of request your friend had? Heh, he will come to the club later. You can talk amongst yourselves. Talon massaged his back as he said, as for what the request exactly entails, I'm not sure either. All right, he's a reporter at the Daily Observer, Mike Joseph. He's probably hoping for some short-term protection. All right. Klein didn't ask any more questions. He continued practicing his shooting, but he didn't limit himself to a revolver. He also practiced with a hunting rifle, a single-shot rifle, and a repeating rifle. He hoped that if he encountered any problems in the future, he would be able to use any of the firearms around. Shortly before 12 noon, he returned to the first floor, went into the buffet cafeteria, and got a serving of roast chicken and a piece of pan-fried steak, as well as the club's limited supply of cream cheese lobster. After placing his meal down, Klein got some Potter seafood rice, fruit salad, oyster broth, and marquee black tea. Facing this sumptuous lunch, he couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva as he praised the goddess in his heart. If this was eaten outside, it would probably cost 3 solely. Klein switched between using silver knives, forks, and spoons as he ate in contentment. When he was almost done with the food on the table, Talon Dumont led a man, in a heavy overcoat and a half-top hat over. Detective Moriarty, this is the friend I was talking about, Mike Joseph. Mike, this is the famous detective, Mr. Sherlock Moriarty. Talon smiled and introduced them. Nice to meet you. Mike took off his hat and bowed. He looked to be in his late 20s, with rather sparse eyebrows and rough skin. His pores were unusually prominent. However, his facial features weren't bad. His blue eyes were especially charming. The 2 thin lines from the meager mustache gave him a somewhat mature charm. Klein couldn't help but stroke the stubble that had become thicker around his lips. He got up and invited the other party to sit down. Then he smiled and said, today's cream cheese lobster is pretty good. You can give it a try. All right. Mike Joseph didn't refuse. He took a plate, made a circle, and picked up a lot of food. He came in a hurry, so he hasn't had lunch yet. Talon smiled as he explained for his friend and placed a stack of newspapers on the table. Tea can tell. Klein set down his knife and fork, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and sipped his black tea leisurely. He was very satisfied with the meal. At that moment, Mike Joseph came back with 2 plates of food. He took a few quick bites to fill his stomach before looking up at Klein. Detective Moriarty, have you heard about the recent serial murders? The ones which had organs removed? Klein's heart skipped a beat as he asked. Talon nodded and said wistfully, as expected, every detective is paying attention to this serial killer. Mike pulled out one of the papers and pushed it to Klein. This is the latest story. Klein took it and discovered that it was the Daily Observer where Mike worked at. On the front page were the words, 11. Another lady killed. Civilhouse Yard is helpless. The headquarters of the Backland Police Department was located at Civilhouse Street at the edge of Empress Borough, so they were also known as Civilhouse Yard. 11. It's already the 11th case. Klein resisted the urge to frown and continued reading. He found that it was indeed the same as the case he had previously encountered. The victim was a woman dressed in a gorgeous long skirt and had her intestines removed from her stomach. This is clearly a case with signs of devil worship all over it. The Civilhouse Yard must have handed the case to the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or the Machinery Hivemind Squad. They have people capable of divination, mediumship, and all sorts of magical and effective Beyonder methods. How is it that the case hasn't been cracked? Why isn't the criminal arrested yet? Does the criminal have rich anti-investigation powers and is able to destroy the souls of the deceased? Or could it be that the deceased soul, along with her innards, were extracted to fulfill the requirements of the devil worship ritual? Yes, he's definitely capable of interfering with divination. Indeed, if the devil pathway Beyonders lack such powers, how could they dare commit serial murders? Klein thought as he said to Mike Joseph, you want to do a private investigation. Team, sorry, I can't take this case. Without the invitation of the police, I cannot take it. I have to maintain a good relationship with them. The so-called good relationship is the kind where they invite me to the police station for coffee. Klein did some self-critical lampooning. The real reason for his refusal was that it was easy to run into official beyonders involved in the investigation of the serial killings, perhaps including the Backland Diocese's Nighthawks. No, not an investigation. No, the precise description is that it's not an investigation to seek the murderer. I just want to finish my report. Mike Joseph swallowed some shrimp and explained. Report. Klein put down his white enamel cup, crossed his hands, and leisurely asked Mike Joseph. Mike Joseph said, if you buy the Daily Observer tomorrow or the day after, you'll see my in-depth coverage on the serial killing. The most important part is my reveal of what the victims have in common, so as to alert people who fall into this group. Oh, what do they have in common? Klein asked curiously. Mike took a sip of his coffee and said, besides being a woman and wearing a colorful dress, there's one other important thing they have in common. I did a thorough investigation of the victim's career and found an interesting tidbit. Some of them are maids, others textile workers, tailors, and even teachers. On the surface, there doesn't seem to be any overlap, but in reality, they've all been street girls. Street girl? A teacher? Klein asked in surprise. In the Lone Kingdom, teachers were part of the middle class and received at least £2 a week. That was enough to make a woman lead quite a good life, so there was no need for her to be a street girl. The corner of Mike's mouth twitched as he sighed and said, yes, in the past. They may have had very difficult times before they found a job that could support them. I've done a survey before. In Backland, 1 in 6 women, age 15 to 55 is or has been a street girl. This is our country. Foreigners who come here are surprised that a very conservative country, a bustling metropolis, would actually be filled with street girls. This number is a little exaggerated. If it were true, it could only be said that reality can be more exaggerated than fiction. This damned world. Klein was speechless. After some thought, he said deliberately, one question, how does the murderer know that the victim had been a street girl? They don't have labels on them, and even you needed a thorough investigation to discover this. As expected of a great detective, this might be the clue, Mike Joseph answered without feeling surprised. No, if it was a beyonder from the devil path, then the standard he would choose from would be someone who appears to have sunken low, but didn't actually degenerate completely. Furthermore, they should have a keen intuition towards degeneration, and they might be able to see the corresponding color that runs deep. With the colorful dress as a trigger, the target will basically be locked onto. Klein answered himself and asked, so, what else do you wish to investigate? Mike nodded and said, from these 11 cases, 10 of the ladies were once street girls except one. She's still a prostitute at present. Yes, she's the youngest, 16-year-old cyber. This makes it very, very odd. I wish to visit Golden Rose, which is the place where she works for further investigation. I want to see if I can discover anything. Team worried that my questions will anger the people there, so I plan to ask you to protect me temporarily. You don't need to teach them a lesson, and you just need to protect me at the most critical juncture and allow my escape. If nothing happens, I'll pay you £1, and if there's a fight, it'll be raised to £5. What do you think? Klein laughed and replied, let me wash my hands before replying you. He bowed politely and sauntered over to the bathroom where he tossed a coin and obtained a positive answer. 19 Hope Street, Sherwood Borough. This area was located close to the Tussock River, which went through Backland. Pedestrians could see the turbid, but unusually wide water surface through the cracks and crevices in their houses. The Daily Observer reporter, Mike Joseph, alighted the carriage and pointed at a 3-story grayish-blue building ahead of them. He said to Klein, who was standing next to him and wearing a black double-breasted suit and a half-top hat and gold-rimmed glasses, that's the Golden Rose, the best legal brothel in the area of the Backland Bridge, as well as Sherwood Borough. It opens at 3 in the afternoon and stays open until 2 in the morning. The best legal brothels in the Sherwood and Backland Bridge region. In other words, there are better ones in these 2 regions, but they're illegal. Klein silently mused and shot a glance at the entrance, which had an inlaid golden row. It didn't hang any signboards. This doesn't count as a street girl, right? He answered without thinking. Of course, it's of a higher grade. Mike personally led Klein to the front of the building and pushed the door open. As soon as he entered, Klein caught a whiff of a mixed fragrance that was slightly pungent and heard a soothing yet suggestive melody. Instinctively, he looked around and saw bouncers, in black coats and half-top hats, standing on either side of the entrance and in every corner of the hall. As a legitimate business, they were obviously meant to deal with drunkards and boors. The Golden Hall was surrounded by all sorts of sofas, chairs, and even a piano. In the center, there was a dancing area. At that moment, there were many ladies sitting in different areas with their hair colored in gold, brown, pale yellow, or black. Some of them looked mature, some shy and young, some young and attractive, and others who were rather beautiful. These ladies were either enjoying the melody, giggling whilst in conversations with each other, quietly reading newspapers and magazines, or dancing with the men. It was only 3:30 in the afternoon, so there weren't many customers. At a glance, this place looked more like a proper ball than a brothel. If you come after 8 in the evening, you'll see some interesting performances. If any of the ladies catch your eye, go over and invite them to dance, and then ask them for their prices amidst the beautiful melody. If both sides can come to an agreement, you can head to the second or third floor and have a wonderful time in some room. As long as you're willing to spend money, you can sleep here the entire night. Mike turned his head from left to right, suddenly losing his previous calm and gentlemanliness, appearing a little more frivolous. He walked into the hall with a smile, and he approached a young girl who was at most 15 or 16 years old. Is he showing his true nature, or is this in conduct of a professional? Klein watched, a little flabbergasted as he subconsciously followed behind Mike Joseph. The victim, Cyber, was only 16 years old. In theory, a girl of similar age is more likely to be a friend and would know more. At that moment, Mike lowered his voice and explained. He then raised his thin eyebrows and asked in a normal voice, "Which lady caught your fancy?" "Team, just your bodyguard," Klein responded with very normal logic. Mike slightly nodded and suddenly laughed. "Team, not used to being watched when I do that sort of thing. TLL be standing watch outside." Klein understood what Mike meant and took a serious, professional stance. Without another word, Mike walked up to the young girl, bent down, and extended his hand, inviting her to dance. Being a prostitute at this age, Backlund sure is so bedazzling and dirty, to think that there would be a middle-aged gentleman of seemingly good bearing patronizing this place. Even the sides of his hair are white. Klein lowered his hands and stood very straight, watching Mike and the young girl engage in a slow dance. After a few minutes, Mike walked back and said to Klein with slight annoyance, "It's too expensive." As the two approached each other, he added in a low voice, "The girl knew Cyber, but the owner, man, Lopez, forbids them from speaking with anyone else on this matter. Otherwise, they would be severely punished." God, when the punishment was mentioned, the poor girl even shuddered instinctively. I can imagine how horrible it must be. Helpless, Klein sighed in sympathy and asked in a suppressed voice, "So, what are you planning to do?" Don't want to cause trouble for those girls again. I plan on going straight to ma'am. Lopez. Mike patted Klein on the shoulder and said, "Protect me." Klein turned his body to the side and warned in a serious tone, "If we encounter a dangerous situation, you must listen to me. Do you understand? Listen to me." Okay. Mike raised his hands to his shoulders and nodded. As he spoke, he walked towards a single sofa in the corner. There was a charming lady with thick makeup in a gorgeous dress seated there. You don't want to give up after a dance and embarrass yourself in front of those girls. I suggest you talk to ma'am Lopez first and find out the prices of the different girls. Mike raised his voice. The lady heard their conversation and looked over. She slowly got up and smiled. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Lopez. Did any girl catch your fancy?" "Yes." Mike suddenly sized her up and said with a chuckle, "I really admire you." "I admire you too. You're acting like this is your home." Klein's mouth twitched. Lopez's expression froze for a second. Then she gave a fake laugh and said, "Sorry, I'm not feeling well today. You should know that there are times every month where women feel quite under the weather." Seeing that there was no way to get Lopez into a room for a conversation, Mike fell silent for a few seconds before suddenly turning serious. "Ma'am Lopez, I'm a reporter. I wish to understand more about Cyber's matter. Here's my documentary proof." Lopez's face darkened and she replied impatiently, "I've already told everything I know to the police. You should ask them. Cyber was a vagrant orphan who was adopted by me. That night, she accepted an invitation from a guest to spend the night at his house, and she died on her way back in the morning. All right, please leave. Or invite a lady to dance." As she spoke, Lopez waved over two of her bouncers. Klein stepped in to shield off Mike Joseph and escorted him back to the hall. Upon seeing this, the two bouncers didn't rashly chase him away. After a few steps, Klein said in a low voice, "She's lying." "Oh?" Mike turned his head in surprise. When she spoke, her eyes darted around. She didn't dare to look at you directly, but she was also secretly sizing you up, which means she was lying and watching your reaction. In addition, her stance was highly defensive, and she appeared very agitated. Klein gave his analysis. Mike opened his mouth and exclaimed after a few seconds, "You really are a great detective. Only with your keen observation and outstanding deduction skills were you able to discover such useful detail." "That's only because I had my spirit vision on and could see that Lopez's emotional colors weren't right. I came up with the reasons after." Klein smiled and said, "Thank you, it's time for us to go." Mike Joseph looked back at Lopez and saw that she was walking towards the side door of the hall, as though she was going to her own lounge, and that the side door was in a corner of the room. It was very quiet around there, and there were many areas in the hall that couldn't see what was going on inside. There were also two bouncers standing guard outside. "Perhaps we should follow ma'am Lopez and observe her reaction. Maybe the anxiety from just now will make her do something." Mike suddenly turned his head to look at Klein. "Can you take care of those two bouncers quickly?" "Sir, I'm only responsible for your protection, and that's against the law." Klein smiled in response. "TLL pay you more. A total of £5, based on the combat price from before. If there's another fight when we run, it would be £10. Mike Joseph gritted his teeth. "Deal." Klein reached out and shook his hand. Afterward, the two of them circled around to avoid the two bouncers from before and quietly approached the side door. "Guests, please stop. Please leave this area." One of the bouncers stepped forward and stopped Klein and Mike Joseph. "Sorry, will immediately." Klein bowed politely and apologized. At that moment, his right fist suddenly punched out, heavily striking at the bouncer's abdomen in front of him. The bouncer instinctively clutched his stomach, his body bent over. As for Klein, who had now stood up, he raised his left hand and chopped the bouncer at the back of the head. "Pow!" The bouncer fell to the ground and fainted. His companion was clearly caught by surprise at this turn of events. He just stared blankly and failed to react in time. Klein immediately slid over and covered the bouncer's mouth with his right hand and punched his abdomen with his left fist. Bang! The bouncer suddenly bent down and spat out his undigested food, and Klein promptly withdrew his right hand and chopped downward with his palm. At the same time, his left hand supported his opponent, allowing the bouncer to slowly fall onto the ground without making a sound. After exchanging looks, Klein turned the knob, pushed open the side door, and stepped inside. Mike Joseph lowered his body and quickly followed. "Why are you so skilled? You're just a reporter." Klein lampooned under his breath, walking briskly but at a rapid pace along the paved corridor. Suddenly, they heard Lopez's voice. "Tell Capim not to send anyone over in the next few days." "Capim? Send anyone?" Klein looked at Mike and found him looking equally puzzled. At that moment, they heard Lopez's footsteps that were headed towards the corridor. "Let's go." Klein tugged Mike and ran for the exit without turning back. During this process, he closed the side door and broke the lock in passing. It could prevent the people inside from coming out for a while. Then, as if nothing had happened, they hurriedly walked through the hall and approached the exit while hearing faint, angry voices. After reaching the streets, Mike heaved a sigh of relief and said in amazement and sincerity, "I've experienced many similar scenarios, but not once was it as simple and relaxed as it was today. Thank you. I need to return to find out who Capim is." As he spoke, he took out his wallet, fished out a £5 note, and muttered, "But frankly, your price is really expensive. It's worth more than half a week's salary. But you can claim for reimbursement, right?" Klein answered with a grin. Following that, he asked in concern, "Aren't you afraid that Lopez will find your newspaper firm and get the police to arrest you?" "That's a fake ID card." Mike Joseph shrugged with a gesture of familiarity. 74, Klein could only admire him. After watching Mike board a carriage and leave, he walked diagonally across the street, waited for a public carriage, and kept an eye out for anyone chasing after him. At that moment, a rental carriage slowly approached and stopped in front of him. A middle-aged man in a black coat stepped out the carriage and nodded at Klein. He had blue eyes, a thin face, and gray temple. It was the same old gentleman that Klein had seen in the Golden Rose. He's not a customer of the Golden Rose, he's just like us. Klein suddenly came to this realization. Hello, Detective Isengard Stanton. I'm assisting the police in this case. Can we have a chat? The middle-aged man pointed at the carriage tracks. Other detective. A colleague, however, the fact that he's able to assist the police in dealing with such a serious case shows that he truly is a well-known detective, at least within Civilhouse Yard. Isn't the serial killer involved in devil worship supposed to be handed over to the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or the machinery hive? All the police department needs to do is send a few assistants, so why would they need to seek the help of a private detective? Yes, the 11 serial murders must have caused a sensation. Civilhouse Yard is under a lot of pressure, and they aren't willing to just wait in misery. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, but on the surface, he revealed a smile. All right. He boarded Isengard Stanton's rented carriage and saw a young man with brown hair inside. This is my assistant, Isengard, who had a thin and angular face, introduced. Please have a seat. He didn't close the carriage's door, nor did he let the carriage driver drive the horse forward to show that he meant no harm. Klein deliberately sat down uneasily and asked worriedly, "What would you like to talk about, Mr. Stanton?" Isengard took out a dark pipe and said, "I want to know what you've learned from following Ma'am Lopez. Did you hear or discover anything?" I'm also a detective, and you should know that we have confidentiality agreements in this business," Klein deliberately replied as though he was in a dilemma. "TM asking you on behalf of Civilhouse Yard. This has nothing to do with a confidentiality agreement." Isengard rubbed the pipe with his thumb. "A pound, how about 2 pounds? Having learned a lesson from the previous incident with Marceau, together with the fact that there was no need to keep it a secret, Klein replied without hesitation, "Sure." "All right." Isengard smiled and took out 2 one-pound notes from his pocket. Klein acted as though he was recalling something before frankly saying, "We only heard one sentence." "Ma'am." Lopez attempted to order her subordinates to tell Capim that he's not to send anyone over in the next few days. "Capim?" Isengard nodded, seemingly enlightened. "Got it. You know Capim?" Klein didn't hide his surprise. Isengard handed the notes over and said with a faint smile, "He's one of the most controversial magnates in Sherwood Borough. In Backland, innocent girls often go missing along deserted streets, and after a long time, they might be chanced upon in all sorts of legal or illegal brothels. A lot of rumors point to Capim as the criminal honcho filled with blood and filth on his hands, but due to a lack of evidence, he remains free to this day. Furthermore, he knows a lot of important people. If that's true, then this fellow should die 1,000 times over." Klein nodded, sighed, and said, "This is Backland, Mr. Stanton. I shall bid you farewell. Thank you for your cooperation." Isengard got up midway as a polite gesture to send him off. "By the way, your fighting skills are excellent. Maybe we'll have a chance to work together in the future. How should I address you?" "Sherlock Moriarty," Klein answered briefly and got off the carriage. Only when he boarded a newly arrived track carriage did Isengard Stanton instruct his assistant to close the door and order the carriage driver to head towards Hillston Borough. Turning his head to the side, he looked out of the window. The gray-haired elderly gentleman had put away his dark pipe, pulled out a brass ornament from his pocket, slowly stroking it in his hand. The brass ornament was a pocket-sized open book with a vertical eye in the center. The appearance and getup of Mr. Moriarty from just now were a bit out of place. He wore very cultured gold-rimmed glasses, but he had deliberately grown a beard around his mouth, making him look crude and barbaric. This is not quite in line with the norm. In this day and age, people who wear gold-rimmed glasses tend to care a lot about their image, the image of having knowledge and bearing. Maybe he's trying to hide something, of course. It's also possible that he's a gentleman with an unusual aesthetic sense. Isengard seemed to be talking to himself, but he also seemed to be teaching his assistant. At that moment, Klein, who was sitting on the carriage, mumbled to himself silently as he leaned against the wall, that Detective Isengard Stanton is problematic. Ever since I activated my spirit vision, he had a blue color of rational thought and indifference, and maintained a purple color of spirituality dominance. There weren't many other colors of emotion appearing. For normal people, unless they're wholeheartedly focused on studying a difficult problem, it's very difficult to maintain similar states for extended periods of time. Other emotions will inevitably appear, the difference being the issue of how long they can remain in that state. Yes, either Detective Isengard Stanton is one such genius at observation and reasoning with extraordinary talent, or he's a Bayon. The track public carriage had 2 floors, as it ferried more than 40 passengers towards the Backland Bridge area. Klein gradually reined in his thoughts and cast his gaze out the window and admired the 2 to 3-story buildings on the other side of the road. Occasionally he could see brown houses 5 or 6 stories high, a sign of Backland's latest trend and of the kingdom's most advanced construction technology. After a transfer, Klein arrived at Iron Gate Street and got off the carriage opposite the Bravehearts bar. As it wasn't the peak period at the bar yet, the moment he entered, he saw Kaspars drinking at the bar. The old man with the brandy nose had requested for a glass of Langsky proof. His eyes narrowed in satisfaction as he savored the fragrance of the malt and the burning sensation in his throat. Klein moved closer, rapped the counter, and asked with a smile, "Is Merrick here?" At the same time, he had one hand in his pocket as he gripped Isaac's copper whistle, using his spirituality to shield its negative effects. Before he finished his sentence, he felt gazes sweep past him. It was evident that they were observing him. By the time he finished asking his question, the gazes moved away from him and focused on Caspar. The old man with the huge scar on his face opened his eyes, and when he saw that it was Klein, he said in a bad mood, "He didn't come. He didn't come yesterday either." "He didn't come." Klein let out a breath of relief, no longer using his spirituality to rap Isaac's copper whistle. "When I mentioned Marek, someone looked at me. When they heard that I was asking him for his whereabouts, the gaze shifted again. Someone is also looking for Marek." Klein resisted the urge to turn around and observe as he analyzed the abnormality. Combined with an original doubt of his, he felt that the question now had a general answer to it. "I was puzzled last week. Why would a Sequence 5 Miss Bodyguard accept a 3-day protection mission for £1,000? This isn't to say that the price is too low, but rather that someone of that level already counts as a powerful person. In the Church of the Goddess, she's qualified to be a Nighthawk deacon or a diocese bishop. If she can gain the favor of a holy artifact, she can even compete for the position of an archbishop or a high-ranking deacon among the various secret organizations and intelligence agencies. Sequence 5 also implies that the person would be the person in charge of a borough, or at least the number 2 or 3. Even if it were a Beyonder who isn't a part of any organization, a person with such strength would be able to establish a small organization of their own. No matter which point of view it was from, Miss Bodyguard could enjoy tributes from her subordinates, so there was no need for her to personally take the job. At the time, I thought that I had most likely hired a Sequence 6 security guard, who would be able to last a little longer against the experts sent by Backerland, creating a chance for me, but who knew that Miss Bodyguard would be so terrifyingly strong? Judging from today's events, Miss Bodyguard and Marek are probably similar to me. Their identities are sensitive, and they have to hide away. Yes, their situation might be even worse, and they have to constantly worry about being hunted down. To be able to hunt Miss Bodyguard, even if that organization doesn't have any high-sequence Beyonders, they must have some holy artifacts or multiple Sequence 5 members, of course. This is just my hunch. Perhaps it has to do with the exposure of Marek as a Beyonder, and he's now targeted by the Machinery Hivemind squad. After some thought, Klein said with regret, "Is that so? I was planning on playing cards with him." Upon hearing something that didn't match Klein's usual manner of speech, Kaspars was alarmed. He didn't look around either, but chortled and said, "I'll be having a card game tonight. Texas, do you want to join in?" "No, I just want to play till dinner." I think I'll just head home." Klein sighed and left the Bravehearts bar without even ordering anything to drink. He had intended to ask Kaspars about other Beyonder gatherings, but in that situation, he carefully abandoned the idea. In fact, he could have gone to a card room or some relatively sealed area to talk with Kaspars, but just to be safe, he decided to wait until next time. Klein was in no hurry to return home. Instead, he went to the one-bedroom apartment he rented in Eastborough and started divining above the gray fog to confirm that no one was following him. After easing his mind, he reached Minsk Street before it was completely dark and found all sorts of subscribed newspapers crammed into his mailbox. "I was in a hurry to leave today, so I didn't even have time to read it. At the Quelog Club, I had a good meal after shooting practice and took a nap, before being forced to play a few tennis matches with Talon. My skills aren't good enough, but my physical fitness can make up for that." He mumbled silently as he opened the door and went inside before twisting the gas lock. He brought the newspapers into the living room and sat on the sofa. He lit the wall lamp and started reading. Klein first read through the Backland Morning Post and immediately flipped to the 5th page and saw an advertisement. It was an advertisement for the Ernst firm's purchase of goods. The prices were 7 pence per liter of flour, 1 solely of butter, 6 pence per pound of lard, 1 solely 3 pence per pound of cream, 8 solely per pound of Marquis black tea. In other words, there would be a Bayonder gathering in the same place at 8 in the evening tomorrow. The code to the door is to knock 7 times heavily, 1 time lightly, 6 long intervals and 1 short interval in that order. The remaining 3 and 8 are meaningless. Klein interpreted the content, leaned back against the sofa, and began to look forward to the gathering tomorrow evening. He wanted to sell some formulas to see if he could buy the corresponding ingredients or items. Formula Wednesday night, 5 minutes to 8. In an alley behind Braveheart's bar. Klein circled around for a while based on his memories, before finally finding the house with the dark candlelights. He was disguised today in a grayish-blue worker's uniform, cap, and a beard so that no one would connect him to the guy who had tried his luck by buying Black Snake's item. It would be best if Eye of Wisdom and the apothecary don't recognize me. Otherwise, a newbie who had relied on luck to become a Bayonder and was able to come up with several potions after a week would definitely be suspicious. Klein put his hands in his pockets and felt for Azek's copper whistle, the ordinary tarot cards, and the charms he had replenished. His uniform was specially modified by a tailor. There were many small pockets with metal bottles filled with herbs powder and extract essence. After taking a deep breath and slowly exhaling, Klein took out the metal mask that could only cover half his face and finished the first step to his disguise. Following that, he used the clown's ability to control his facial expression and his physical tics, as well as his gait while numbing his facial nerve. He wanted to be vastly different from his previous self. However, I'm not sure what Eye of Wisdom relies on to recognize people. This is all I can do. Sigh, if only I was already a faceless, but if that's the case, I wouldn't need to join such low-level Bayonder gatherings. Klein stood outside the door in silence for a few seconds. He then raised his right hand and knocked on the door, 7 hard knocks and 1 light one, with 6 long pauses and 1 short pause in between. Almost without waiting, the small wooden board on the door was silently pulled open, and an eye appeared behind it. It examined the visitor from head to toe. 2 or 3 seconds later, the door creaked open, and Eye of Wisdom's attendant handed a hooded black robe to Klein. Klein maintained his emotionless state as he quickly put on the robe and pulled down his hood, letting the shadows cover his face. On the way to the living room, he deliberately took steps he wasn't used to and tried his hardest to eliminate the awkwardness. There was only 1 candle in the dark and silent room, and quite a number of members at the gathering. Klein didn't choose a corner like the previous time. Instead, he sat on a high stool right in the center. In short, he wanted everything about his external appearance and behavior to be completely different from the previous 2 times. And it was precisely due to his identity as a clown that gave him this domain of expertise, allowing him to reflect his own body into his mind and gain fundamental control over it. The living room was so silent that it appeared frozen. Time passed by, and finally Eye of Wisdom looked at the clock on the wall and said in his ancient voice, "It's time. Let's begin. We don't need to wait for our late friends." Just as he finished his sentence, Klein immediately said with a hoarse voice, "I want to sell potion formula. They are sequence 9 barred and sequence 8 light suppliant from the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. The former is 220 pounds, and the latter is 450 pounds. This was the most suitable plan that he could come up with after much consideration. The Spectator and the Telepathist potions were related to the Psychology Alchemists, a secret organization that was still active in Backland in the Lone Kingdom. If he recklessly produced them, he might attract their attention. And the Church of Eternal Blazing Sun was blocked out by the Church of the Lord of Storms, so the corresponding Bayonders rarely appeared in Backland and could do very little. Therefore, it was an extremely safe choice. The potion of the seer pathway involved Klein himself, and he certainly didn't want to reveal his characteristics. After having experienced so many battles and watched so many battles with Bayonders, he gradually came to understand something. It was that below the high sequences, Bayonders of different pathways had their own characteristics which didn't overlap. That was to say, each of them had their own strengths and weaknesses, and their strengths and weaknesses were all very obvious. The strengths were indeed strong, and the weaknesses were indeed weak. For example, the spectator pathway lacked the ability to fight in actual combat, but if they were ignored and were unconsciously misled, then no matter how strong an opponent's combat skills were, it was possible for them to die without knowing why. A clear example would be Hurricane Rear Admiral Kalangos, who clearly possessed the mystical item, Creeping Hunger, and had an overall combat strength of a Sequence 5, but he still died in a rather inexplicable manner. Most of this was thanks to Azek, but one couldn't dismiss the role of the spectator. Due to the fact that the majority of the Beyonder jobs below the high sequence had distinct characteristics and obvious weaknesses with weak bodies, if one could conceal one's strengths and understand the situation of their enemies beforehand, it wasn't impossible for them to defeat someone stronger. In extreme cases, there was still a very small chance of a Sequence 9 killing a Sequence 5. Of course, this was a perfect hypothesis, but in reality, it was almost impossible. Sequence 5 was already considered strong, and the corresponding Beyonder powers could be considered miraculous. Strengths could effectively cover up weaknesses, but before reaching Sequence 6, it was very difficult to cause any effect on them. On the other hand, many of the Beyonders below high sequences were very afraid of being attacked by a group, even if their opponents were all below their own sequence. This was because, once one became flustered, their attempts to avoid a fault would lead to failure of another. Their weaknesses could lead to fatal outcome. These problems were why shepherds were ranked first below high sequences. They were so all-rounded that if they combined and matched their Beyonder powers well enough, they would almost have zero shortcoming. After I advance to the Sequence 7, I'll have all sorts of magical Beyonder power. Then even if I encounter a Sequence 6, I'll be able to contend against them for a while, and I might even be able to win. If I encounter a Sequence 5, there might still be a chance of escaping. As his thoughts raced, Klein looked around, waiting for someone to speak. If Bard and Light Suppliant can't be sold, then I can only go for second best and consider selling Spectator and Telepathist. In consideration of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility and conservation, the formula of my own pathway definitely shouldn't be sold. The witch pathway wouldn't as well, for it would lead to many tragic cases. Whether it's instigator or witch, they're the type that necessitates committing evil deeds. Klein was a little nervous, but his face remained expressionless as he waited. Actually, I can consider buying it. At that moment, the chubby apothecary laughed. I can also accept another apprentice and give him these two formulas, making him specialize in praying for light to shine on my herb. Perfect. How extravagant. His words broke the momentary silence in the room. A man in the corner who had his hood pulled very low spoke in a deliberately sharp voice. Perhaps I can give it to my child. At least it's stronger than my sequence. Sequence 9, 200 pounds. Sequence 8, 400 pounds. If you agree, we have a deal. To be able to take out 600 pounds at one go means he's quite rich. That's enough to buy a house in Tingen City. Klein pretended to think, looked at the other members at the gathering, and observed their reaction. Noticing that no one had the urge to raise the price, and that the other party's bid had reached his bottom line, Klein thought for a while and said, I'll tag on an additional request. You cannot sell these two formulas in this gathering, but you are free to do as you wish elsewhere. The man said sharply, All right, mister. I have wisdom will bear witness. Klein didn't know how to prove that the formula was real, but he didn't want to ask as it would expose the fact that he hadn't participated in many gatherings. Therefore, he silently pulled up his robe and took out the two potion formulas he had written long ago and handed it to an attendant beside him. The attendant didn't walk to the corner. Instead, he went to the single sofa in the center and handed the folded paper over to the Eye of Wisdom. The old gentleman spread out the paper and, without taking an extra look at it, placed it on a small round table beside him. Then he took out a handkerchief and wiped his right palm. From his pocket, he took out a ring inlaid with many tiny diamonds. This ring was complicated and exquisite in design. In the middle of the ring was a dark green gem that looked like an eye. Just by looking at it from a distance, Klein felt his head swell and his body turn uncomfortable. It was just like back when he was taking his math examination. Eye of Wisdom solemnly wore the ring on his right middle finger and then closed his eyes, as if he was preparing something. Suddenly, the emerald green gem on the ring bloomed with a resplendent golden color, which was as bright as the sun. Eye of Wisdom quickly extended his right hand and let the gem touch the potion formula written by Klein. The rays of golden light became purer until they eventually turned into a holographic projection. Authentic and effective. I have wisdom, announced in a low voice. He immediately removed the ring from his finger, not daring to wear it for another second. His tone sounds just like a notary. That ring is the most prized item in Mr. I have Wisdom's collection, sealed artifact 2081. It emulates the powers of a notary. Klein watched on thoughtfully, feeling a little covetous. After the notarization, the deal was quickly concluded, and Klein received a thick wad of cash, all in 10-pound notes. After counting the bills 3 times, he didn't fold and put them in his pocket. Instead, he held them in the palm of his hand and waited for an opportunity to spend them. He planned on observing for a moment to ensure that there was nothing he needed before speaking again, to mention his desire to purchase things. At that moment, the apothecary looked around and said, "I brought a few bottles of sedatives." He really brought it. I've already forgotten all about it. In order to be different from his past self, Klein could only pretend that he wasn't around. After shouting a few times and seeing that there was no response, the apothecary muttered, "That guy didn't come this time. Maybe he's dead somewhere. Thank you for your blessings, but it's delightful that you failed to recognize me." Klein heaved a sigh of relief. The apothecary habitually asked for Spring of the Elves' marrow crystals again, but it was in vain as usual. Moments after he shut up, a woman whose face was completely shrouded by her hood said with 2 boxes at her feet, "I have 2 weapons with Beyonder effects. This must be the lady who sold the inscribed steel sword the last time, right? My spirituality instincts as a seer tells me that she has another 2 similar weapons. Backing her is some Beyonder armament organization, right? Well, maybe she has an artisan behind her, also known as Sequence 6 of the machinery specialist in Savant Pathway." Klein looked over with anticipation. He had agreed to give the son a Beyonder weapon worth 500 to 700 pounds, which could effectively his combat ability. He didn't promise the specific type and characteristics. So long as it was similar and could be used, he could buy it. In any case, the son wasn't picky about it. The woman with the hooded face looked around her and said, "The 2 weapons this time are easy to carry around. One of them is the Whip of Slowness. It's a replica of a particular mystical item. It can constantly create formless restraints, influencing your opponent bit by bit, slowing down his actions gradually. The longer you last in battle, the more effective it would be. TT can still be used for 2 years. 450 pounds, or the potion formula for Barbarian. This whip sounds pretty good, and it feels like the spider silk ability of the Demoness of Pleasure. However, would it seem a little strange for Little Sun to use a whip?" Klein asked in a hoarse voice. "Can this invisible binding effect affect spirit-type creature? For example, wraiths?" The lady shook her head slowly. "No." Without waiting for any further questions, she continued introducing. "The second weapon is called the Axe of Hurricane. It can raise the user's agility and running speed. There's also a 15% chance of inflicting a numbing effect to the enemy, and a 5% chance of producing a bolt of lightning. If used in a thunderstorm, the chance of the lightning bolt will be raised to 50%. This has all been verified through experimentation and concluded through copious amounts of data. This weapon's effects can last for no more than a year. 520 pounds, or the potion formula to Barbarian. This is much stronger than the Whip of Slowness. If it wasn't for the fact that it only has the Beyonder effects for a year, it probably wouldn't be this price, right?" According to the description of Little Sun and the scene I vaguely saw, in the air above the city of Silver and the surrounding area, there are always flashes of lightning. The highest frequency is during daytime, and the lowest frequency is during nighttime. This is very similar to a so-called thunderstorm environment. If it's really effective, then this Axe of Hurricane would be a truly mystical item in the hands of Little Sun. Each strike has a 50% chance of blasting out lightning. It would be absolutely formidable. Even if that doesn't work, looking at the most basic Beyonder effects of the Axe of Hurricane, it's still quite a good weapon, and it meets the needs of Little Sun. As for the problem that it can only be used for a year, it's not a big problem to solve. In 1 year, with Little Sun's digestion rate and City of Silver's Beyonder resources, as long as he has the potion formulas, he would at least be Sequence 6 by then. At that point in time, he'll definitely need to replace his weapon. As his mind whirled, Klein basically determined that he was buying the Axe of Hurricane. At that moment the apothecary muttered, "Is an axe easy to carry around?" I feel like I've heard a joke, and I think it might be more appropriate to make a wrench. Say, can't you sell stuff like revolvers with bay under effect? T will try my best to collect similar items. The woman emphasized the word collect. All right, friends who are willing to buy one of these weapons, please make a bid. Before Klein could even speak, he heard a male voice from the long sofa. Axe of Hurricane, 520 pounds. The woman waited a few seconds before asking again, is there anyone else who wants to bid? 530 pounds. Klein added 10 pounds. The man immediately replied, 550 pounds. This little son, if he raises it to more than 600 pounds, I won't be buying it. I'll get you a new whip. With a definite strategy in mind, Klein called out very calmly, 560 pounds. He tried to make it appear that no matter what offer was made, he could add on an additional 10 pounds. And the 600 pounds he had just earned was just enough to put invisible pressure on the other party. Upon hearing the latest price, the man fell silent and shrugged. All right then, it's yours. Phew, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. T.S. there anyone else who wants to bid for the Axe of Hurricane? The woman asked again, but the room was silent. Sold. The lady didn't hesitate any longer and handed the box next to her right foot to the attendant. The attendant had the eye of wisdom appraise it before bringing it to Klein. Money was handed over in exchange for the item. Putting away the remaining 4 10-pound notes, Klein opened the box and saw an axe that could be attached to one's back or tucked in one's belt. Its entire body was iron black in color, thick and sturdy, with a sharp edge. In his spirit vision, it was clear that the creator had used a large number of spiritual material. There were also many symbol and magic runes on the surface of the axe. They were embedded inside, turning into lightning and hurricane patterns. When Klein reached out to touch it, he felt a faint pricking pain. He nodded and placed the box on his lap. It can be exchanged for the true root and juice of a mist train. My magician potion is only missing the spinal fluid of a dark patterned black panther. I've made a good deal of money in my past few commissions, and together with my original savings and what I just have left, I have 209 pounds 5 soles and 5 pennies on me. The bay under ingredients corresponding to sequence 7 are valued at 500 to 700 pounds. Heh. I still had to sell formulas or knowledge, yes. I'll take the time to check on Leopard this week and confirm the progress of his bicycle. Klein stopped bidding and quietly watched from the sideline. Later on, someone bought the Whip of Slowness for 480 pounds. An bay under ingredient called Heart of Featherman wasn't sold because its price reached 1,600 pounds and nobody wanted it. According to his knowledge of mysticism, Klein knew that this bay under ingredient would be classified in the category of sequence 6. In the following transactions, more failed than succeeded. After all, most of the bay unders who came to the gathering had a specific purpose, and they wouldn't casually waste money and resources. They weren't like Klein, who bought any weapon as long as the bay under effects were good enough. T. Want to sell a formula potion. Sequence 9 Corpse Collector. 230 pounds. Towards the end, a man sitting quietly in a corner said with a deep voice, Corpse Collector. I remember that this potion formula can only be found in the Church of the Evernight Goddess, Church of the God of Combat, and the Numinous Episcopate. Has an undercover Nighthawk sneaked in? Or is he a member of the Numinous Episcopate who's trying to revive death? Of course, it isn't that strange for low-sequence formulas to be found in the wild. This isn't a huge secret. I remember old Neil mentioning that the formula for Corpse Collector involved a desiccated black-spotted frog. Klein controlled himself and didn't smile. He thoughtfully looked ahead and discovered that the potion formula of Corpse Collector was quickly sold. The potion formula for Sequence 9 is very easy to sell. Before, there was just a single Sequence 8 Folk of Rage formula that failed to close several times, while my light suppliant formula matched with Sequence 9 Bard was sold relatively easily. Yes, most Bayonders would collect Sequence 9 formulas if they have the money to spare. They can give their own children and students more opportunities to choose from, allowing them to walk a path that they prefer. Under this premise, if a Sequence 8 formula doesn't have the foundation Sequence 9, they would have to wait for Bayonders who are attempting to advance, and there might not even be one in 1 to 2 years. After all, the circle of Bayonders is very scattered, and most people don't know about the acting method. Yes, they also don't know the law of Bayonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Klein silently thought and didn't speak. After another 15 minutes, seeing that the gathering was about to end, he asked probingly, Who has the complete spinal fluid of a dark-patterned Black Panther? Silence. No one spoke in the living room. Klein thought for a moment, then added, I will provide payment that no Beyonder would refuse. For example, the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Unfortunately, I've already sworn to the goddess that I wouldn't impart the acting method to anyone else. I've already died once. I wonder if that oath is invalid. Klein forcefully retracted his scattered thoughts, but he still didn't hear anyone speak. Okay, next. He deliberately made a shrug that he wouldn't normally do. The apothecary cleared his throat and said, I've brought quite a few of my own medicine. Take a look at what you want. It's not expensive at all. It's just a few pounds or even a few solely. When the lady selling Beyonder weapons heard this, she asked curiously, I want to know if the dangerous beast in the sewers has been eliminated. The apothecary snorted immediately. You asked the right person. After saying that, he spread out his hands. Don't know either. After I got someone to make a police report, I haven't been to the sewers ever since. Bro, you're asking for a beating. It must have been hard for you to grow up so healthily. From the looks of it, it was very wise of you to choose the apothecary job. Klein couldn't help but lampoon in Chinese. The woman took a deep breath and slowly exhaled without saying a word. When all the strange medicine the apothecary had brought were sold, Eye of Wisdom announced that the gathering was over. He delegated Klein to be fifth to leave, through a secret passage in the basement. From the looks of it, Eye of Wisdom didn't recognize me either. With some relief, Klein took off his hooded robe and tossed it to the attendant. Then he walked out of the passage and skillfully circled around it. After confirming that no one was following him, he took off his iron mask, left the secluded street, took the box containing the axe of Hurricane, and headed straight to East Borough. There were no gas lamps on Black Palm Street in East Borough, and after dark, it was like an abyss. In a particular apartment here, Klein sealed the room with a wall of spirituality. Then he summoned himself and carried the axe of Hurricane above the gray fog. If it had been a little heavier, I wouldn't have been able to carry it with me, even if I had Mr. Azek's copper whistle to reinforce my spirit. Then I would have to switch to a sacrificial ritual, Klein mumbled, sending his thoughts to the illusory star corresponding to the sun. The world has sacrificed the weapon to me. You can prepare the bestowment ritual. City of Silver. Upon seeing the gray fog and hearing Mr. Fool's instructions, Derek Berg immediately sat up and rushed to prepare. Before holding the bestowment ceremony, he silently took out his knight's sword and made a few vertical slashes to ease his anticipation. Would it be a straight sword, a broadsword, or a rapier? Derek stopped without realizing, unable to stop himself from thinking, and subconsciously pictured himself using that powerful weapon. After a while, during the ritual, he saw the Beyonder weapon that belonged to him. It was an axe. Dear Mr. Fool, please tell Mr. World that Peel try to gather the mistraint's true root and juice as soon as possible. After receiving the son's reply, Klein nodded indiscernibly and muttered to himself. From the looks of it, he's rather satisfied with the weapon. Even without the additional effects from the environment, the axe of Hurricane is still quite a formidable weapon. He had passed the information regarding the Beyonder weapon's characteristics and limitations to the son. He didn't describe it directly in order to avoid sounding nagged. He needed to maintain his image. After doing all of this, Klein didn't stay any longer and immediately returned to the real world, changed his clothes, and left Black Palm Street. East Borough Derivy Street, in a cramped but lively pub. Theoderica covered her nose and mouth as she squeezed in. What was bad about this place wasn't just because it smelled of alcohol and sweat, but that she would easily encounter people much taller than she was. She had to face their armpits, and the strong odor was nauseating. Using a great deal of effort and even using the powers of an arbiter, Zia finally squeezed her way to the bar counter and saw the man she was looking for. It was a young man in his 20s. He had a face as long and thin as a horse. His eyebrows were messy and ferocious, but his facial features were relatively soft. He was gulping down alcohol and laughing loudly with the patrons around it. Williams, I have something to talk to you about. Zio banged on the wooden counter. This boorish action immediately attracted many angry gazes. However, they quickly retreated under the stern gaze of an arbiter. Oh, Zio, I haven't seen you in days. Let me see, it's been a week, no, at least 3 weeks. Care for a drink? Half and half, Williams said, half drunk and half surprised. Half and Half was one of the most popular alcoholic beverages in Eastborough, made from malt beer and fortified grape wine, and because it is precisely made up of two constituents of equal proportion, it was known as Half and Half. Are you really going to let me drink? Zio pricked up her brows. No, he doesn't. The boss, who was wiping the glasses, hurriedly answered on Williams's behalf. He clearly remembered how deadly the girl would become when she got drunk. She would use her fists to persuade the guests to quit drinking and throw them out one by one. The corner of Williams's mouth twitched as he spread out his hands and said, "Go on, why are you looking for me?" He was one of Eastborough's informants and was connected to several gangs. Zio frowned and said, "Williams, can't you quit drinking? Save your money, marry a nice girl, and come home every day to hot water, food, and warm greetings. You can share all the things you've seen in the day with her, and she can tell you about the trivial things that happened in your house, and there will be cute kids who will kiss you on the cheek and play around you. Isn't such warmth nice?" She was able to gain a quick foothold in Backland's Eastborough, all thanks to Williams's help, so she had always wanted him to be better off. Warmth? William scoffed. It's built on the money I bring back, and I've seen through the farce. If I could bring home 20 soldi a week, I'm sure my family would be warm and just as you described it to be. But if not, Lord, the screams and insults from the woman, the cries and shrieks of children would drive me crazy. My mom is a good example. Every time my old man comes home, he'll beat me up and make a ruckus, so if that's the case, I might as well use the soldi and the pence on me to trade for drinks. No one cares how much I earn here. Everyone drinks and chats, and the mood is really good. If I want women, there are cute street girls outside. They wouldn't quarrel with you." Zio smirked and said, "You really are an incorrigible believer of the Lord of Storm. One day you'll die from alcoholism or some strange disease." "At least I've enjoyed life," Williams replied without minding what she said. "I haven't worked in almost 3 days, so I'm not going to give you a discount." Zio stopped persuading him. She stroked her short, disheveled blonde hair and handed him the portrait of Lanevis that Audrey had given her. "Help me keep an eye out for this man. Find him as soon as possible. Here are different portraits of him." William spread out the piece of paper in his stupor and glanced at it before tusking. "He looks too ordinary, and there are so many people in Eastborough. There are people who die at any moment. Some leave, some come, and others become vagrants. It'll be difficult to find him. In short, help me keep an eye out. Notify me immediately if you find anyone who looks like him." Zio took out a 5 soldi bill and handed it to him. "Here's some beer money. If you can find the person in the portrait, Peel, give you another £10. £10? Williams whistled. "Zio, when did you become so generous? Or is this person worth more?" "That's how much his reward is worth. £10 for providing clues." Zio pretended to look around the pub and answered, "Don't forget about this matter. I'll come back in a few days' time." She had already run through nearly half of Eastborough and issued the mission to the gang leaders and informants she knew, and she had paid several pounds in advance. As long one of them succeeds, he'll earn it all back. All those profits. Zio silently cheered herself on and walked out of the pub with her nose and mouth covered. At that moment, the scene gradually turned chaotic due to some conflict between a few drunkards. Zio glanced over in exasperation, then raised her voice and shouted, "Stop!" A sense of dominance reverberated within the pub, and it was as though the drunkards had met their nemesis as they hurriedly sat down. Some of them even hugged their heads and squatted on the ground. "Phew, I wonder when he'll advance to sheriff," Zio sighed, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. On Thursday morning, Klein took the long trip to St. George Borough, which was like another city altogether, to show some concern for his first investment. With his last tip and the revelation from Roselle's manuscript, Leopard was progressing very quickly on the bicycle project and had already built a crude prototype. This was very much in line with Klein's impression of bicycles. After a trial ride, Klein offered a few suggestions for improvements, saying he would disburse the second investment payment next week, and expressed his hope of bringing in new investors as soon as possible so that the project could enter an industrial phase. The only problem was that Leopard believed that he was the inventor and had the right to name the product. He wasn't satisfied with the term bicycle and intended to adopt the more popular term bike. Klein didn't care. At noon, he returned to 15 Minsk Street, but before he could take off his hat, he heard a series of illusory pleas. Miss Justice, she has collected the information on the abject nobles so quickly. Still in thought, Klein prepared to enter the living room and head to the second floor. At that moment he heard the doorbell, and when he opened the door, he saw Julian, the maid from the Sammers next door. Mr. Moriarty, Mrs. Sammer would like to invite you to a Sunday luncheon. There will be a lot of neighbors attending, the maid said as if she was reciting something. After his return last night, Klein had handed the portable camera to Mrs. Sammer and exchanged a few words with her, but he hadn't received any indication of a luncheon. That's right, according to the magazines, the middle class wouldn't invite anyone to an event in person, but instead, they formally sent their servants or maids to send the invitation. This is in line with Mrs. Sammer's style. Klein was puzzled at first before he immediately came to a realization, so he promised to punctually attend on Sunday. Who wouldn't want to have a free lunch? And Mr. and Mrs. Sammer aren't very difficult people to get along with, as long as you don't mind their showing off, Klein secretly added in his heart. He watched as Julian left. He closed the door behind him and walked toward the stairs, his eyes scanning the slightly messy living room, dining room, and kitchen. It's been a few days since I've cleaned up. I'm a bachelor, so it's not bad that I'm able to maintain a level of tidiness such as this. I have too many secrets, and I might even suffer an attack. It's not too good to just hire an in-house maidservant for chores. Yes, I should discuss this with Mrs. Sammer on Sunday and ask her to send her maid to clean up twice a week, and I'll pay for it. Many tenants and landlords have had similar agreements. Klein calmly walked into the bedroom on the second floor and drew the curtain. After entering the fog, he found that the prayer had indeed come from Miss Justice. This girl of blue blood sat on a piano stool, her hands on the keys. She wasn't playing the piano. Instead, she was whispering the honorific name of the fool that doesn't belong to this era. V gathered the information regarding the abject nobles. I'm requesting permission to hold a sacrificial ritual and seek your help in passing it to Mr. World. That's quick as expected of a professional, Klein immediately responded. Audrey, who had just returned from the Royal Coat of Arms office and experts in this field, completed the sacrificial ritual with a little unfamiliarity as she threw the thick manuscript into the illusory door. TLL, pass it to the world. Klein's tone was indifferent as he cut off the connection. This time, he was in no hurry to return to the real world. Instead, he flipped through the manuscript and found the part pertaining to the Pound family. The Pound family had indeed obtained the title of Viscount from the Battle of the Violated Oak. After that, they were loyal to the royal family, and they had quite a bit of power in the army and their own fiefdom. However, 32 years ago, two of the family's heirs died from serious illnesses, one after another. At that time, the old Viscount had no choice but to bring the child of a distant relative home. Not long after, the old Viscount passed away. As the child was still young, under the enticement and instigation of the servants, he changed the butler and turned fop. In just 8 years, he had lost most of his fortune and was reduced to a baron. Even the family's house in Backland was sold. In the years that followed, his title was reduced once again to that of a baronet. Died of serious illnesses. Their corpses are probably nowhere to be found. They should all be in that innermost room in the underground structure, outside that bloody door. The old Viscount must have deliberately concealed the matter, preventing the royal family, military, or churches to investigate. From the looks of it, the Pound family must have discovered the underground structure from the Fourth Epoch about 30 years ago. Perhaps the underground secret door was built by them, but there are more than 2 corpses in that room. There were others who had entered in ancient times to probe the area. Well, I'll have to talk to Baronet Pound in a way that won't reveal my identity. Klein stopped thinking and looked at the last paragraph. He saw what he wanted, Baronet Pound, currently living at 29 Civilhouse Street, Empress Borough.